Welcome to my channel. You can catch this disease just by walking in water. No need to drink it, no need to eat anything. A simple contact with fresh water. And that's it. And the worst part? Over 250 million people need treatment today. Nearly 700 million live in at-risk areas. This disease can destroy your liver, your bladder and trigger cancer. Without you realizing it for years, it's called schistosomiasis. And today, you're going to understand why it's one of the most overlooked yet most dangerous diseases in the world. A massive, yet invisible disease. Imagine a disease that affects millions of children across Africa, keeps them out of school, slows down their physical and cognitive development, and causes the loss of millions of healthy life years every single year, what researchers call DALYs. And yet, nobody talks about it. Schistosomiasis is what we call a neglected tropical disease, an NTD. It primarily strikes sub-Saharan Africa, which accounts for over 90% of global cases, rural areas near freshwater sources, the most economically vulnerable populations. And here in Senegal? The Senegal River, Lac de Guiers, and the river basin are well-known endemic zones. Studies have shown very high infection rates among children in certain fishing and farming communities. This is not just a disease, it's a social justice issue. How you get it, hold on. Because the life cycle of this disease is both fascinating and terrifying. It all starts in the water, a lake, a river, a pond. In that water, there are microscopic larvae called cercariae. These cercariae come from a freshwater snail of the genus Bulinus or Biomphalaria, depending on the region. Here is the full cycle. An infected person urinates or defecates near the water, the parasite's eggs are released into the water. These eggs hatch and release larvae called myricidia, which infect the snails. Inside the snail, the parasite multiplies and thousands of cercaria are released back into the water. These cercaria penetrate your skin directly within just a few minutes. Once inside your body, they transform into schistosomula, migrate through your bloodstream and settle in your veins. Intestinal or bladder veins, depending on the species. And there, they lay eggs. Continuously. It's these eggs trapped in your tissues that trigger a chronic inflammatory reaction, and that's what destroys your organs. Contrary to what is often said, cercarial penetration is not entirely painless. It often causes itching and a skin rash within hours. This is known as cercarial dermatitis or swimmer's itch. Signs you should never ignore. There are two main forms of schistosomiasis, and it's important to distinguish them. The urogenital form, Schistosoma hematobium. This is the most common form in West Africa, including Senegal. Signs include hematuria, blood in the urine. It was so common in certain areas that communities believed it was normal in boys. They called it the male menstruation. Pelvic pain, recurrent urinary tract infections. And in the long term, bladder cancer. This point is critical. Schistosoma. Hematobium is classified as a Group 1 carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, in the same category as tobacco for lung cancer. In Africa, it is one of the leading causes of bladder cancer in young adults. The intestinal and hepatic form, Schistosoma mansoni. Schistosoma japonicum signs include diarrhea, abdominal pain, blood in the stool, and in the long term, hepatic fibrosis, portal hypertension, ascites, the liver swells, the spleen swells, and in severe cases, it becomes a full picture of liver failure. Acute phase Katayama fever. A few weeks after infection, some patients develop high fever, dry cough, hives, muscle pain. This is a massive immune reaction to the parasite's first eggs. It is often mistaken for malaria or a severe flu. Treatment and its limits. The good news: There is a treatment. It's called praziquantel. A single drug, taken in 1 or 2 doses, effective at eliminating adult worms. The WHO funds mass preventive chemotherapy programs, especially targeting school-aged children in endemic areas. But here's the problem. Praziquantel does not prevent reinfection. If you go back into contaminated water the next day, you can be reinfected. Another key limitation, the drug is not effective against eggs. It kills adult worms, but tissue damage already present may be irreversible. Which is why early diagnosis is so critical. What's happening in research today? And this is where it gets truly exciting. In 2025 to 2026, research on schistosomiasis is experiencing an unprecedented acceleration. Vaccines are in development. The vaccine candidate SM14 is in Phase 2 clinical trials. SM-P80 is currently in Phase 2 clinical trials. SchistoShield, another candidate, is showing promising results. The goal, to generate lasting immunity to protect at-risk populations. Diagnostics are evolving too. Ultra-sensitive PCR tests can now detect very low-level infections. Point-of-care diagnostic tools are being validated for rural African settings, reducing dependence on microscopy alone. And the WHO has set ambitious targets to eliminate schistosomiasis as a public health problem by 2030 in endemic countries. Schistosomiasis means 250 million people affected, 700 million at risk. A parasite that destroys the liver and bladder and can cause cancer. A treatment that exists but isn't enough on its own. And a vaccine pipeline that is rapidly advancing. This is not a disease of the past. It's a disease of today. And if you live in West Africa or South America, it may be closer to you than you think. Where does this disease come from? A global history. You might think schistosomiasis is exclusively African. In reality, it's an ancient, worldwide disease, deeply woven into human history. A disease. Thousands of years old. Traces of schistosomiasis have been found in ancient Egyptian mummies. Yes, this disease already existed over 3,500 years ago. This isn't just oral tradition, it's paleoparasitology. Calcified eggs of Schistosoma hematobium were identified in the kidneys and bladders of Egyptian mummies dating back to 1250 BC. Documented in landmark studies as early as the 1970s. Furthermore, some researchers believe that what the Bible describes as the plagues of Egypt, particularly blood in the waters of the Nile, may have an indirect connection to this disease and its effects on local populations. At the time, populations lived along the Nile used water for irrigation and farming walked barefoot through irrigation canals. The cycle was already there. And it has barely changed in 3,500 years. What has changed? Our capacity, still limited, to stop it. In Senegal, an explosion. Linked to major infrastructure. In Senegal, the current situation is no accident. It is largely tied to one specific, well-documented event. The construction of the Diama Dam in 1986 on the Senegal River at the Senegalese-Mauritanian border. This anti-salt dam was built to block saltwater intrusion and enable agricultural irrigation. But the public health consequences were dramatic. The salinity of the river dropped sharply. Downstream of the dam, conditions became ideal for the proliferation of bulinus and Biomphalaria snails. Slowed water flow created stagnant water zones, perfect for the parasite's life cycle. Within just a few years after construction, schistosomiasis prevalence in certain riverside villages jumped from near 0 to over 70 to 80% among children. This is one of the best documented iatrogenic epidemics unintentionally triggered by human intervention in West African history. Studies published in The Lancet and PLOS NTD have precisely traced this epidemic explosion back to the dam's construction. An economic development project can become a public health disaster if its environmental impact on vector-borne diseases is not anticipated. In Japan, a total victory. And its lessons. Japan is a fascinating and inspiring case. There was a local form of schistosomiasis caused by Schistosoma japonicum, primarily in the Kofu Basin in Yamanashi Prefecture. S. japonicum is a particularly formidable species because it infects not only humans but also cattle, goats, dogs and rats. These are animal reservoirs that make elimination far more complex. It produces 10 times more eggs per day than S. mansoni. It causes very severe hepatic complications. And yet, Japan completely eliminated it by 1996. How? Mechanical destruction of snail habitats. Rice paddies were lined with concrete and irrigation canals were redesigned. Agricultural mechanization, water buffaloes and oxen, animal reservoirs were replaced by tractors. Massive sanitation improvements, latrines, running water mass treatment of both human populations and domestic animals. Rigorous epidemiological surveillance maintained over several decades. The last autochthonous case in Japan was recorded in 1978. Transmission was officially declared interrupted. What this teaches us: eliminating schistosomiasis is not a utopia, but it requires a multi-sectoral approach: health, agriculture, environment, infrastructure, and sustained political will. In Brazil, the legacy of the slave trade. Schistosomiasis is not native to the Americas. It was introduced through the transatlantic slave trade between the 16th and 19th centuries. It was the people enslaved and brought from West Africa who carried Schistosoma mansoni to the New World. Snails of the genus Bilharzia were already present in Brazilian freshwaters, which allowed the parasite to establish itself and complete its life cycle in this new environment. Today, Brazil is the most affected country in Latin America. Approximately 1.5 million people are infected, primarily in the northeastern states: Bahia, Pernambuco, Minas Gerais. These are also the regions that received the largest numbers of enslaved Africans. This is a powerful example of how the historical violence of slavery has left lasting epidemiological scars. Schistosomiasis in Brazil is literally a biological scar of the transatlantic slave trade. Schistosomiasis in Corsica, France. Europe is not spared. What very few people know: schistosomiasis emerged in Europe, not in Africa, not in Asia, in France, in Corsica. What exactly happened? In 2013 to 2014, clustered cases of schistosomiasis were detected among people who had swum in the Cavu River near Sainte-Lucie de Porto Vecchio in southern Corsica. Soma bovis, a species that normally infects cattle. This was the first time in history that a schistosome hybrid was documented infecting humans in Europe. How did it happen? Several factors converged. 1. The presence of the host snail. The snail Bulinus trunculus, a compatible intermediate host, was already naturally present in Corsican freshwaters. 2. Introduction of the parasite. Infected tourists or migrants likely contaminated the water with parasite eggs through urine or fecal matter in or near the river. 3. Favorable climatic conditions. Corsica offers high summer temperatures, shallow, warm fresh water, slow river flow during summer months, ideal conditions for Cacaria to survive and develop. 4. The capacity for hybridization. S. hematobium and S. bovis can hybridize inside the Bulinus snail, producing a parasite that is more adaptive and potentially harder to control. More than 120 confirmed cases between 2013 and 2016. Patients were primarily French and European tourists who had swum in the Cavu River. Cases were reported across several European countries: metropolitan France, Germany and the United Kingdom, published in Emerging Infectious Diseases, CDC, and Eurosurveillance. This is the largest outbreak of schistosomiasis ever documented in Europe. The Corsican episode demonstrates that schistosomiasis is no longer confined to the tropics. With climate change warming European waters, growing international human mobility, the presence of compatible host snails across southern Europe, countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece could face similar emergence risks in the near future. The hybridization factor, an underestimated threat. This may be the most alarming aspect of this entire story. S. hematobium can hybridize not only with S. bovis but also with Schistosoma curasoni, Schistosoma mathii. These hybrids can display increased virulence, infect new intermediate hosts, show reduced sensitivity to praziquantel, in some cases spread into entirely new geographic zones. Researchers at the Institut de Recherche pour le Développement (ZRD) in France have been actively monitoring these hybrids since 2014. How were the Corsican cases managed? Praziquantel treatment administered to all confirmed cases. Enhanced surveillance of the Cavu River, European-level reporting through the ECDC network tourist advisories issued warning about the risks of freshwater swimming. The Cavu River remains under active surveillance to this day. What we can conclude from this section: schistosomiasis in Corsica is a wake-up call. It tells us that this disease is evolving. It adapts. It travels with us. And if Europe, with all its advanced healthcare systems, struggled to anticipate and manage this emergence, what does that mean for countries with far fewer resources? That is a question every global public health decision-maker should be asking. If this video taught you something, share it with someone who lives near a river or a lake. You could literally save their life. Subscribe to the channel to understand the diseases that truly affect our world, with real science made accessible and useful.